In today's show, Keith Smith of Spotrac and the NBA Front Office Show joins the program, and we talk all things Trail Blazers off-season. Welcome to Locked On Blazers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Trailblazers, your daily Portland Trailblazers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, world? It's your past first point guard and Trailblazers reporter, Mike Richmond. You are listening to another episode of Locked On Blazers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, available wherever you get podcasts and also on YouTube. Thanks for making this show your first listen, coming at you each and every weekday, Monday through Friday. So make it a part of your daily routine. Tell your friends to do the same. Make it your first listen as Locked On Blazers, your team every day. Today's episode, a very special one. We are joined by first-time guest, but not first-time aide of the program, because Keith has responded to a couple of my emails. Keith Smith of Spotrac and the NBA Front Office Show. Keith, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to come on here. So you are an incredible resource for me, even when you're not responding to my emails, because you update and maintain the Spotrac.com with all of the financial information for across the league, which also just has a beautiful UX. It's just a wonderful user experience. I will say that. It's maybe its greatest strength is it's very easy to navigate. I want to sort of leverage your expertise of the cap and the Blazers situation. Let's just start broad. Like, what is, you're listening, dear listeners, to Tuesday, June 4th show. What is the Blazers situation heading, pre-draft, heading into the offseason?
Yeah, it's not as rosy as I think you would hope for a rebuilding team, a team that's coming off a really tough season. But it's almost not unexpected either. The way the NBA works now these days is it's pretty rare we don't see a lot of those team trades out 50 million and brings back 20 million deals anymore. It just rarely works that way. So what happened with Portland as they made their series of trades, first with Damian Lillard, they brought in a bunch of money. Then when they retraded or flipped Drew Holiday, they brought in some more money then. So now you're sitting on some contracts that you'd probably, if we were being honest, rather not have. But here we are. Now they got to deal with that. So they are, despite the fact that they were one of the worst teams in the league, they're right around the luxury tax line for this upcoming season. And that's a really tough spot to be in when you are a team in their position, standings-wise, roster-wise, and the like.
Does having those salary slots, like the larger money, obviously DeAndre Ayton's making a ton of money. I don't think he's likely to be traded for a variety of reasons. But is there some value like in having some tradable contracts like Malcolm Brogdon, say, or Robert Williams, guys that got back in the Dame trade? Or in your eyes, would they have been better off trying to end up with some cap space this summer? More flexibility is the word we often see bandied about.
Yeah, and that's like my favorite word to use is flexibility, because people get so hung up on cap space has to be used to sign free agents. And in reality, it can be used to facilitate trades and do all kinds of stuff. So I don't get too hung up on cap space as much as flexibility. And because of that reason, Portland isn't in necessarily a bad space with some of their guys. So Malcolm Brogdon, for example, $22.5 million. I think that's a very tradable number. It's an expiring contract. Expiring contracts can always be moved. There's very little trouble getting off one of those deals. And it's not a situation where it's like, well, we got to move Malcolm Brogdon, so we're having to send out draft picks or something like that. Right. That's not going to be the case. They should actually be able to get a decent return for Malcolm Brogdon in terms of whether it's younger player or two or draft asset or two or something like that. Robert Williams, eminently tradable. He makes less than $15 million. He's right around the mid-level exception. And the nice thing with a guy like him, under the new CBA, because this upcoming year, he is set to make about $12.4 million. That number is less than the mid-level exception. In this year, brand new under this new CBA, teams can use the non-taxpayer mid-level or the taxpayer, but in this case, the non-taxpayer is the one we care about, as a trade exception. So a team that is over the cap could trade for Robert Williams, just trade him right into their mid-level exception, which is different. That's a new thing. It's a little hard to predict how that's going to work because it's brand new. We haven't seen how teams will do that yet, but it is something. So if you have a team that's out there like, man, what we really need is a valuable backup big that can come in and give us 15, 20 minutes a night, they might look at that and say, you know what? Rather than sending Portland back salary they may not want, we'll send a draft pick or maybe a younger player who makes 5-6 million, and we'll take Williams into our mid-level exception, and we'll go that way. So that's going to be something that's going to be interesting to watch play out as well this year, because that's a whole new world. So I think they're in a good place as far as some of the guys. I hesitate to put it this way, but some of the guys that maybe you don't really want on the roster on a rebuilding team,
Right.
They're very tradable players. These are not guys where you're like, oh man, we're stuck with a $50 million contract for this dude who doesn't play, or he's a really tough fit for 90% of the league and the other 10% can't afford him anyway. So that makes it really hard. They're in a place where I think they could move money around with relative ease this summer.
Yeah, I think that's key. You mentioned Robert Williams. Matisse Thybulle's in the same camp. Like he fits in that non-taxpayer mid-level exception that everyone's going to, that not everyone, but many competitive teams across the league are going to have access to. And that gives them a little bit of flexibility. They don't have a lot of wiggle room. You mentioned that they're right up against the tax line. Like they've got 11 teen. That's a good number for you. We're recording early in the morning on the West Coast. They got 11 guaranteed players and 3 partial or non-guaranteed guys. But 2 of the partial non-guaranteed guys, Jabari Walker and particularly Toumani Camara, like Toumani is part of the plan. Like I don't think there's a world in which he's not back. I think there's a very slim chance where Jabari Walker's not back. And then the third partial guy is Delano Banton. He's got such a small guarantee that I don't think they'll make a decision on him for a while. I believe it's $200,000 according to the numbers from Keith that I am looking at on my screen over here. But like they don't so you go in with 11 guaranteed and 3 partial guys. Let's say like they keep 2 of those. They're basically at a full roster with 13 players plus 4 draft picks. How do they, like, what should their approach to be this summer, knowing that they kind of got the crunch? And we'll talk about the tax stuff in the second segment.
Yeah, I think so. You can do a couple different things. You can either try to move off like Brogdon or Williams or Thibault or even Jeremy Grant, if one of the cap space teams was there. And let me just say this now. I don't think Jeremy Grant is this horrible contract that people paint him out to be. In a few years, it could be that we could be in a position where that one's now a little underwater. It's turned a little sideways, maybe a little sour as he's aged. But right now, I think it's fine. It's not a max deal. So we're not in a place where it's like, oh my gosh, this is one of those $50 million contracts or anything. So I think Portland's actually in an okay place. And of the cap space teams, I can see a world where a handful of those cap space teams are like, you know what, Jeremy Grant actually fits pretty good with what we need. Let's try to make a move. So I'll kind of semi-include him in this as well.
Sure.
Where what I would say is I think one of your ideal scenarios would be, let's try to get off one of those contracts or 2 of them, or maybe even 3, if we can, of the guys that we're trying to look to move on from. And let's do that in a way where we're not bringing a player back necessarily, or if we are, we're bringing a guy back that we can cut or retrade or whatever with relative ease. Maybe you work a 3-team deal or something like that. Because then what that does is, 1, gives you the very necessary financial flexibility that you need. And I know we're going to get into that more in a minute, but it also frees up the roster spots. And that, I think, in some ways is almost the bigger immediate challenge, is those roster spots. And that can also come through, like you said, I don't think Kamara goes anywhere. I think Walker's a guy they prefer to keep. I honestly think Banton, with the way he played down the stretch, is a guy, beware the numbers on a lottery team in March and April, right? I fully get that, but he's a guy who's flashed at times. I know, being someone who covers the Celtics or covered them quite a bit, there was a lot of excitement when they got him because, hey, big ball handlers right now, that's always a thing you want to have. He showed flashes in Toronto. Maybe there's something here, and I think he showed that again with Portland. So I think you'd like to keep all those guys, but yes, you do hit a point where we can't roster 30 guys. So what are we doing? We're going to have to make some tough decisions somewhere. But I think that's the ideal approach. Move 1 or 2 of those guys for a little less salary back, or more importantly, free up a couple roster spots in a trade like that. Even if it turns into, hey, we packaged 2 for 1 in a trade where we did something like that, that could be a thing we see as well.
Exactly. Yeah, and especially because with Williams and Thibault, they could be, if you make the trade simultaneous or whatever, at the like have those guys get absorbed into an exception and then trade Grant for the money or however it might work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Jeremy Grant's dollar figure is that bad. I think the years might turn some teams off. It kind of like the back half of that contract is like, 36-year-old Jeremy Grant. Okay, like you start to get into what it is, but good teams, to particularly like competitive teams, they will be less worried about that timeline. They'll say, our goal is to be very good in the spring of 2025. Can this dude help us be good in the spring of 2025? And I think that will have some appeal, but there will be a slightly smaller market just because of, because he freaking clutch sports them and he got 4 years plus a team option heading into unrestricted free agency. I would say if there's anything we've learned about the Blazers under Joe Cronin, it's that if they have an pending unrestricted free agent represented by Clutch Sports, that person is going to get a payday. And shout out to Yusuf Nurkic and Jeremy Grant. It's been good for him. The Blazers, in addition to having this sort of roster crunch, as you mentioned, which I think the roster numbers is more important than the salary itself. They also have 4 draft picks in this upcoming draft. It's going to get a little crowded. Let's talk about a little crowded and maybe approaching the first apron in the second segment. Join us there, won't you? But first, I want to tell you that today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NHL and in the NBA. We've reached the finals, baby, and FanDuel wants you to make every playoff shot count. That's why new users of FanDuel can get $150 in bonus bucks with any winning $5 bet. You put in your $5 bet, you get that W, and then you get $150 of bonus bets to play with, whether you want to go props or money lines or any futures bets that you're into. Why not make the playoffs a little more exciting? FanDuel.com/lockdown. Make sure you visit that URL one more time for you. FanDuel.com/lockdown. It's FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. All right. I'm still Mike Richmond chatting here with Keith Smith of Spotrac and the NBA front office show. Keith, are the Blazers going to be a first apron team? And what does that mean?
I really hope not. That's a rough place to be if you are a team that's probably, I'm not trying to be insulting by any means, but probably not going to be very good.
They're bad. They're bad. They're the 15th. Yeah, they're one of the worst teams in the league, and they probably want to be one of the worst teams in the league again. Like that's like their goal. They want to be young and rebuilding. And being young and rebuilding and expensive is dicey.
Yes, I always say this: you can be expensive, you can be bad, you can't be both. If you're both, that's a problem. That's generally when we start to see front offices, people start losing jobs, guys start getting moved on from, and things just get really rough. So I think what we're looking at with Portland is there is a need to let's do what we can to get out from underneath these apron concerns. And people have said, hey, when I look at it, I add all the salaries up and they're not even over the tax. Yes, but then you have to add in the 2 draft picks, and the 2 draft picks are about $11.5 million combined. So once you add in the 2 draft picks, now you're over. Now, what I think they may do, because of what we referenced in the first part of our chat, was a roster spot crunch. They may take a kick the can down the road approach with that second draft pick, especially of, hey, somebody's trying to trade back in, one of these teams that wants to get in. That is kind of like what Phoenix did a little bit with, hey, we don't have a lot to offer, but we can give you a future swap, right? Phoenix is a bad example right now because they've already Horcruxed all their picks as much as you possibly can. So I think what you could be looking at is like Milwaukee or Boston or one of those teams that, rougher. They may say, hey, you want to do a swap right in 2029 or 2030? We'll do something like that so that way we can get a pick a little higher now, because because we're a second apron team, we can't go out and sign these guys. We can't sign free agents. We're minimum contracts, sign our own draft picks. So there where I think that's a way where Portland can maybe, all right, we alleviate a little bit of the pressure on ourselves. We move off, we free up a potential roster spot that way, and now we keep things moving down the line. So I think that's kind of a really important thing to factor in here, as well as anything they may do with moving players. But if we were to just say everybody is back and they make the draft picks, they're going to be flirting with that. They're going to be over the tax, and they're going to be flirting with that second apron. And that's really, really tough because that just puts a lot of restrictions on what you can and can't do. And what you don't need when you're a bad team is restrictions on what you can't do as far as trading players and the like.
What would be the most prohibitive restrictions that they would hit? So according to your numbers real quick, and I don't know if these are updated to the second, but the Blazers are about 8 million shy of the first apron. They got a salary allocation of about 170 million bucks. The line is about 178 and a half. So they're $8 million away from it. If they have picks 7 and 14. If they were to sign both of those draft picks, rookie first round rookies, it's a salary slot. There's no negotiating. Everybody gets 125% of their slot. Basically, I don't remember someone getting less than that. Everybody gets the number that they're slotted for, and then you're just over. But if the Blazers were to take both those picks and end up, they wake up on June 29th as a team in the apron, what would be the restrictions that they have?
So when you get to a spot where you're over the first apron, people know about the whole coming down on the super expensive teams and all that. You hit a spot where first apron also gets a lot of restrictions on them, and probably the most prohibitive for Portland, because we're not talking about a team that's going to be really playing in the free agent market or any of that stuff. But the prohibitive one is you can only make trades where you bring back 100% of the money you send out. Now, we've just spent a whole lot of time talking about they probably don't want to bring back more money than they send out in the trade. Ideally, you want to bring back less, but you have to. And if it's a have to, that's worse than a just want to, right? If it is, we can only bring back what we send out. So Malcolm Brogdon, I just use him as the example because this is a nice round number of 22.5 million. They can't bring back 22.7 million in a trade. They can bring back 22.5 million or less. That's what they could do. So that's where it gets really kind of restrictive on the teams. And then there's a bunch of stuff like can't sign buyout players. You don't have signing exceptions, those kind of things that probably aren't really going to matter this year for Portland. But really, it's that trade restrictions beyond the fact that if you're that far over, that means you're 11 plus million or so into the luxury tax. And that's not where you want to be either.
Right. And I don't think ownership will, I think I think they will enter the season or at least get there at some point before it kicks in. They're not going to be a tax team. Like they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league. They're not going to be no ownership group.
Can I add something to that real quick? I'm sorry. And I apologize for interrupting you, but what you said, I think is really important to build on there is at some point, because we get this mindset of you have to be there by the end of the offseason when the season starts, and you don't. As long as you get there by really it's the trade deadline, because you're probably not going to make meaningful enough roster changes after. Like, for example, is there a world where if Malcolm Brogdon's still on the roster at the trade deadline, they work a buyout? Sure. But it's not going to be a buyout where he's like, here's $20 million back.
Yeah, here's $8 million bucks back to help your tax situation. Yeah, exactly.
It might be, here's $2 million back to set me free and let me go somewhere. And that may matter down the line, but it's really important to know it's really by the time the trade deadline passes, you need to be under the tax, because that's kind of your first big window is the summer. And then your next and final big window becomes the trade deadline. So that's why when you said at some point, that just triggered for me. That's really important for people to know, because I've had people say, well, now we're a tax team. Now, the challenges of being a tax team with all the restrictions that puts on you, that all exists there. Now, one other thing with the draft picks that I want to know too, I would not be surprised if there's a slight delay for Portland on signing those guys for two reasons. One, you're helped this year that Summer League doesn't start until the 12th of July. That's really kind of when you have to have guys signed, because guys aren't going to play in Summer League until they've signed a deal. So that's helpful. It also, they don't count as salary fully until they're signed. So you're still kind of operating in this world where those guys are draft rights until they're signed, and draft rights are sitting out there. They have a cap hold towards being over the cap, but for tax purposes, they're not going to hit. So they'll be able to do some stuff where they could do some unbalanced trades. They could do a deal where it's like, hey, we need to deal one, we take in a little bit of money, but in deal two, we're actually getting off that money or whatever it is. So there may be a minimal 4 or 5 week long delay until we see those two guys get signed. that's assuming they even make both of those draft picks too. That's another part of that as well. So I just wanted to add that just because they've got some ways they can dance and work around this luxury tax stuff if they have to.
Yeah, I think like it's not clean, but like you said, like when you move off a max contract like Damian Lillard, and they didn't prioritize expirings, right? They prioritized some sort of like tradable veterans, and they really wanted, for better or for worse, DeAndre Ayton, and like he also makes a lot of money, and they became a more expensive team. I want to I want to ask you kind of like about how teams might need to approach it in the new CBA climate. We don't know yet, but I think there was a time when rebuilding teams like the Blazers would take a different approach than I think Portland's going to be able to. Let's talk about the new world to close the show. Join us in that third segment, won't you? First, I want to tell you that this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Therapy can be incredibly beneficial no matter what you're going through. If you're experiencing a major trauma in your life, talking to a neutral third party, a therapist with regularity, can be super helpful in kind of getting you back on track and helping you develop the tools you need to get back to being a better or the best version of yourself, considering your circumstances. But whether it's a major thing or a minor thing, therapy can be incredibly helpful. You do not need to be experiencing a major trauma to benefit from therapy. Talking to a neutral third party about the everyday challenges of your life can also be extremely beneficial. So if you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and then you switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Still past first point guard. I'm still Mike Richmond. You are still listening to Locked On Blazers. Still chatting here with Keith Smith, Spotrac, and also the NBA front office show. Keith, there was a time when bad NBA teams would head into the offseason with like $60 million in cap space and just say, okay, we're just bad and really cheap, and when you have a bad contract, send it our way. You can't really do that anymore. Like, because of the salary floor, there's a number you have to hit. Now, the Blazers don't really have a path to create $60 million in cap space, right? That's not very realistic. But I guess there is a world in which they get intentionally cheaper to absorb some bad contracts. What is the best approach for rebuilding teams now, knowing that you can't just kind of cruise in there with dead money?
Yeah, it is interesting, like you said, and you said it kind of closing out that middle segment of where Portland didn't necessarily prioritize, we have to have expiring contracts and the like, because that is certainly one path. And then you're right, that used to be the kind of prescribed path for a bad team was we're getting off all the money we can. We only want guys on rookie scale deals, guys on expiring contracts. That's how we're going to operate. And yes, it's I feel like we're taking a little shot at our friends on Locked On Pistons here, but the Pistons approach of, hey, just but send us, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, you're bad contracts. Yeah. Here we are. Arms are open. We'll take all of them and off we go. And we'll see how they even operate under a new front office this coming season. But there is an approach now of actually, as long as we're not taking back terrible long-term contracts, we're okay. And I think that's the path Portland took, which was, hey, Malcolm Brogdon, still going to have value. There are a bunch of teams with cap space this summer. And what makes it unique this summer with the cap space teams is those cap space teams are good teams or teams that are trying to be good. Detroit is the only bad cap space team this summer. The other teams, the three of the teams with some of the most cap space that I project, Philadelphia, Orlando, and Oklahoma City. Three teams that playoff teams that are trying to be good. What are the ones right behind them? The Utah Jazz. They're sending signals. We're going after players this summer. We're not just taking in assets. We're not just going to take care of our own guys. We're trying to get really good. San Antonio, there's a world. I don't think they're going to get super impatient, but there's a world where, hey, we'll take on a couple veterans because we're trying to grow around Victor Wembanyama and grow into a good team. So that really kind of leaves Detroit and maybe Charlotte. We'll see what happens in their situation of bad teams with some cap space. Where for Portland, that's like money in the bank because it's like, hey, wait a minute, you need a couple good players. Maybe free agency didn't work out for you. You had plans to sign player X. That didn't happen. Well, guess what? You still need a point guard. What do you think about Malcolm Brogdon? Hey, guess what? You still need a big, and a big who's on a pretty affordable contract. What about Rob Williams? Oh, you still need a wing who maybe if the shooting in Portland carries over elsewhere, I don't know what kind of vortex he stepped through, but you want Matisse Thybulle, right? Now he's a 3-and-D guy. They can pass the red face test and package him as that because that's what he did for them. Or, you could even get deeper in of, hey, you think Jeremy Grant's the guy to really lift you and you can afford his contract? Let's go. So that's where I think for Portland is you end up in the same end place. Whereas if you took back a bunch of bad contracts, but you could move off those contracts in that, hey, we moved off a bunch of money. We're sitting on some guys. We don't really want them because you're not going to trade all those guys away.
Right. You're not going to trade 6.
Back.
Yeah.
Exactly. But what we got back was in each one of those trades, either they attached a young player we want to take a look at to the money we're taking back, or they gave us a draft pick. And now we're sitting here and we're building up our stash. And we're going to move forward with still all that flexibility. It looks slightly different, but we've got a ton of flexibility and we've got draft picks and a bunch of young players. And that starts to feel a lot more like the traditional kind of rebuild that we're used to.
Yeah, I think it's it'll be curious because I think they have to make a move on draft night. Like in addition to the two lottery picks, like they have 2 second rounders. Obviously they can sign those guys to two-way deals, but 34 is relatively high up in the draft for a guy to be like, heck yeah, two-way contract. Great. Like that might be a thing where the agent is like, don't draft me. I'm not a two-way guy. Like this is someone who wants mid-level money or like part of the mid-level, like, a long-term or a multi-year deal that is
second round pick exception, right? Where exactly. I want that. Like I want the 3 or 4 year deal where I'm coming in long-term. I will say 34, that could be a prime space where take a draft and stash kid where it's right. Like, hey, he's going to stay over in Europe for a couple of years. But even that starts to be a little bit high because I think people have you get a little squeamish where it's like, hey, wait, we made one of the first picks on this new second night, right? Because that pick's not being made at 11 o'clock at night anymore.
Oh, it's going to be a TV thing. Yeah.
Time. Yeah, exactly. So it's going to be like, oh, we drafted a guy who's not going to come over here for 3 years. And it's funny because I can only imagine the Blazers fans my age and a little bit older being like, yeah, we did that with this guy named Arvydas Sabonis. And by the time we saw him, he was 100 pounds heavier and couldn't move, even though he was still awesome. But like, what are we doing here? So I think that becomes the point where, I'm with you. You've got to do something. They cannot come out with having made 4 draft picks this year. I'd be very shocked if they did, unless they lined up a move that cleared 2 or 3 guys off the roster entirely.
Right. Like they traded 14 in Brogdon and ended up with 22 or something like that. And it's like, yeah, and then they get another useful young part and then another pick. Like, there's a world in which they shed salary and make 4 picks. I don't think there is a world in which they just say, draft night, let's make our picks. We're on the clock. Let's do it. And then go from there just because they can't. I wonder is like, just to close out here, like with a team like this, they're pretty far away from being really competitive. The West is just so freaking good. Like I think they could make some relatively aggressive moves and end up the 13th best team in the West, right? Yeah. What is in sort of, obviously there's some older teams in the sort of in the middle of the West. So there's a world in which teams, some particularly 2 teams that are based in Los Angeles. But like what do you think the Blazers approach should be in terms of like timeline? Are we talking 4 years? Are we talking 2 years? Like what should their goals be when they make moves this summer in terms of thinking about when they want to be competitive?
I'm going to answer this first by looking back at this past year. And what for me becomes the roughest part about this past season was, yes, there was a world where all the guys they traded for, fit seamlessly and they were still a playoff contender, right? That could have happened. I think we're all a little more realistic of that probably wasn't going to be the way.
Yeah, they were going to, if they were fully healthy, I think they still missed the play-in, but they would have not been, it wouldn't have felt like it did.
Agreed. So what I look at though, when I land in this spot is, all right, if you're going to be bad, being bad is fine, right? It happens. Every team goes through it. Well, you can't be in that. This will be my second thing. I already said you can't be bad and expensive. where it becomes a lost season is when your young players that you're trying to figure out what you have miss a bunch of time. And I think the single biggest thing Portland lost this year was, what is the fit of Scoot Henderson, Anthony Simons, and Shaden Sharp? Is there a world where can those three guys play together for 10, 15 minutes a game? Do we have to, are we looking at and saying, man, we are set we got a backcourt of three guys that all fit together pretty well, but two of them at a time, but that's fine. Now we've got, we've got our 120 minutes of really good guard play in our backcourt, or even more than that, whatever, 150 minutes, whatever, however you work out your math with that. So there's your one thing there. Then I think your other challenge became, all right, and then we didn't get to see those guys with some of the other young guys. And that's where a bad season turns into a lost season. So I think in a lot of ways, barring them saying, you know what, we're going to move Anthony Simons, I think what we run into in this situation is we're almost starting over again with we're starting over with year one on this. I apologize. My dogs are losing their mind over something. I don't know what it is.
Well, hey, listen, we got to the end of the episode before the dogs got upset. So I think I think they did pretty well.
Yeah, they did okay. There's probably like a squirrel in the backyard or something that's driving them crazy. But anyway, my point on that was, when you hit now, you're almost kind of, I call this like, if year zero was last year, now you're in year one of the rebuild, where it is, all right, now we're going to find out what we've got in some of these kids. We're going to continue to clean up the books. We're going to continue to collect assets. So to answer your actual question about how long, I think you're probably looking at minimum 2 more years of just building up. And then we'll see, because one of the things in the West, it's super deep right now, but a couple of those teams are older. So some of those teams, I think, are going to come back to the pack a little bit. They're going to slide, and that's where you want to be positioned. Now, your challenge is the other, if we call them bad teams, as I put that in quotes, is Memphis isn't really a bad team. They just have
they're really good
off this year.
Yeah,
they're going to be pretty good. San Antonio is Wembanyama, so they should be pretty good here in another couple years. So what you're hoping is you're trying to keep pace a little bit with those guys as some of the other teams come back to the fold, and then you're moving up. But the world is there where that could happen in 2-3 years if they kind of nail their draft picks, they hit on things right. I think the important thing is everybody should be kind of okay with being really bad this year, because this looks like a pretty good draft coming forward. So hey, if we're kind of bad this year and we're adding Cooper Flagg or Ace Bailey in this draft, and we've cleaned up our books and we've added other draft picks, let's go. I think they're in a really good spot that way.
Yeah, there's a spot. There's a world in which they're a 60-loss team, and it feels a lot better than last year. And I think that's the key for them, right? Is like just for larger fan base vibes. It's just if this is year one after like a year zero where they just don't know anything, they just didn't get enough data to figure out who they are. If year one is similar in terms of record, right? They're no good. The offense is all these things, but you get to see the flashes. You get like no good record wise, but you get to see the flashes. It's going to feel a lot better. Then you end up with another top 5 pick. You're going to be in a much better spot. It's just, they've got a lot of steps to do it. And some of it is just getting a little, cleaning up some of, like you said, cleaning up the books a little bit, because you want to go into next summer with the F word, baby. You want to have that flexibility, because if you're bad and have added to your asset chest and have some flexibility next summer, you've got a much cleaner path back to being good. And like at some point, LeBron James is going to age. And at some point, the Clippers are having all mid-30s guys is going to matter, and all of those things. And, maybe the new world of the CBA makes it impossible to be good for that long of a time. And so every team takes a 3-year wheel, and the Blazers will get their chance to do it. Keith, thanks so much for joining the program. It was a whole bunch of fun.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Portland's a team that I don't get a chance to talk about too much, and this kind of level of depth. So I was super excited to join. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, of course. If folks are looking for more of your work, where can they find it?
Yeah, you can find my written work. If you like this kind of stuff, this kind of detail, getting into this on Spotrac.com. Right now, where everything is off-season focused. So we've got our team previews are up. We've got our free agent previews are by position are going up. I'll have things like rookie scale extension projections going up soon. We're going to have a whole bunch of off-season content, and then we'll have a whole bunch of stuff reacting to whatever happens at the draft, and then obviously when free agent starts. And if you like this in more listenable format, NBA front office show, that's Trevor Lane and I do that show together. It's a little odd because it's a Lakers guy and him and a Celtics guy and me, but we make it work. We have a lot of fun. We do that Monday through Friday. Every Friday is our live show called Front Office Friday, where we take a lot of questions. It's the fan show, so ask whatever questions you have. We have a lot of fun over there. It's a lot of trade rumors, news roundups, and then a lot of deep dive salary cap stuff. So we have a lot of fun over there too.
Yeah, there's not many people who can make the sort of easily sortable minutia like Keith. He's really an incredible resource. If you're an NBA fan and someone who's curious about how the money works, Keith is your guy. Dear listeners, come back for tomorrow's show. It's what we do 5 days a week wherever you get podcasts. Tell your friends about the program. I appreciate you listening. I'll talk to you soon.